Well, I've been joined now by Mikhaila Peterson, of course, Jordan's daughter, who was on Piers Morgan Uncensored recently. Mikhaila, I know you were watching that last interview that I was doing with your dad there, and he got emotional at the end of that. What do you make of it when you see your dad like that, and why he was emotional in that case?
I think, to tell you the truth, I think he's worn out from doing 10,000 things every day. Even when we tell him to take rests, he doesn't take them. So I think that plays a major role. But also the way our lives have changed has been overwhelming. So when he says he's overwhelmed all the time, I think that that's accurate.
Yeah, I mean, Jordan was saying to me that he's overwhelmed by the sense of responsibility he feels and the influence that he has now over so many people brings with it the burden of that responsibility, and it's something he feels very acutely. Do you see that with your dad on a daily basis?
Oh, definitely. If people approach him on the street, he gets emotional quite frequently because the conversations are emotional. So people come up and say, this is how hard my life was, and maybe my life is still hard, but I'm managing to take it on in a more positive way, and I credit you for that. And he gets emotional, and that's all real, and it's because it's an emotional conversation. So I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, Jordan, that is an extraordinary responsibility. What I'm thinking is I see the two of you here. I read recently, I think it was some TikTok thing I saw, but it was an old business guy, and he was saying, you know, the real definition of success in life is not money or material things or anything like that. The real definition of success is if you're a father and your kids, when they become adults and therefore can make their own decisions, choose to hang out with you because they want to hang out with you. That's the ultimate definition of success. What do you think of that theory?
Oh yeah, that's right. I mean, I would say I feel that acutely. I would say my wife feels that even more acutely. Like, she's so thrilled if her kids want to hang out with her, if they want to do, you know, committed things with her, that she can hardly stand it. And I mean, this is also one of the great advantages of having a family. People just don't understand this. There isn't anything more important that you will have in your life than your kids, period. And it's such we lie to young women so terribly by telling them that their career will be where they find the meaning in their life. I mean, I have a stellar career, and I'm pretty damn thrilled about it, and I should be, but it takes second place to my wife and my kids, and then to my extended family as well. And if you organize, I think that's true even if your family isn't working that well, and it's definitely true if it's working well. I mean, why wouldn't you want to be around the people that you love? That's sort of the definition of love.
Mikhaila, I mean, I would imagine you've had sort of a weird life in one respect where for a long time your dad wasn't a globally renowned figure, right? And then he became one. What was that transition like for you as his daughter, to see your dad go from your dad and an academic and a psychologist and so on,
hero, man,
to suddenly become this sort of, you know, odd superstar of, you know, with an influence over millions of people? What was that like for you?
Well, completely surreal at the beginning. So I remember walking down Bloor Street in Toronto when this first happened, and he was still a university professor, and seeing a picture of Dad on the front cover of a newspaper, and it said something like Heil Jordan. It was something like that, comparing him to Hitler. And it was the newspaper I used to read on the metro on the way to school, and I was like, well, who knows how many lies I've been reading from that newspaper. And then for the next, I would say our family probably only really stabilized in the last year and a half. So it took, what is that, 6 years to kind of come to grips with what had happened to my dad. And at the very beginning, he was kind of lost to the internet. So everybody was wrapped up in this, but at the dinner table and whenever we had conversations, it was really focused on what was the news saying, was he going to lose his job, what was happening online. And it was hard to focus on anything other than that. Even if we said, okay, no media at the dinner table, it was still hard to focus on anything other than that. And I think part of the reason I stepped in to help you and Mom was to have something I was also involved in so that I could be part of the conversation. And I think my brother Julian probably felt that to the same degree, was, okay, well, I guess we've moved from kind of having this more normal family relationship to whatever it is now. Yeah.
You see, it's really interesting. I mean, I love the chemistry between you two. I've got a younger daughter. She's 11. I've got 3 much older sons, all in their 20s, one's 30 now. Very different thing. Very special relationship, I think, of father and daughter. But you talked there, Mikhaila, about a normal sort of family world. I find it hard, Jordan, to believe that the Peterson family has ever been conventionally normal.
Were we normal?
You want to go there?
I feel like it was a lot more normal than it is now, that's for sure. Like, we still had school, you worked, you had a number of jobs, so you worked a lot. Mom was at home, and we had more of a dinner routine and a schedule, so we had that. But I think things were still a little weird now that I know what other families look like more. When you're isolated in one weird family, you don't know that it's weird for a while.
I think the depths of concern in our household and in my life made our existence somewhat not run-of-the-mill, not typical. I mean, the artwork in the house, I suppose, was an example of that. I mean, Mikhaila grew up in a house. There were, 300 paintings, I suppose, in our little house. And
I had Lenin fall on my head in my bedroom when I came back from
that should happen to every teenager.
Wham, Lenin. Yeah.
You had a gigantic picture of Lenin in your bedroom that fell on your head. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. It kind of just leaned over. It didn't crush me.
You were literally struck down by
anyway.
communism.
Yeah.
Jordan, what kind of father do you think you were when Mikhaila was younger? Because I'll get her to fact check it.
Playful. Yeah, we had a lot of fun. I mean, the people I grew up with, my friends in junior high and high school and even later, all we really did was engage in competitive bouts of humor. Like, all the status among the people I hung around with was who could say the most outrageous and comical thing. And I've always really liked little kids. I really like playing with little kids, and I'm quite good at it, as my father was. It's one of his sort of stellar traits, the ability to, he really likes little kids. And he liked me when I was a little kid, so that was a good deal. And I really liked being with my kids. I really enjoyed playing with them. There's very little that I would rather do than play with little kids who are well-behaved. It's ridiculously fun. They're extremely comical. They have a very clown-like nature. They're imaginative, and they see the world through fresh eyes, and that's a great deal. And so whenever I had a moment when I wasn't working, I spent it with my kids and my wife, and we had a good time. I mean, we had our troubles, partly because Mikhaila was so ill, but it was always play and humor and teasing, but not mean, like fun.
I mean,
competitive fun. And both my kids
you
have vicious senses of humor, and so that's great.
And I had the same with mine. I know exactly what you mean. Mikhaila, you've had periods in your life as a family where your dad has probably feared he may lose you. You feared you may lose your dad, and you both may have feared that you would lose your mum, Mikhaila, and Jordan, your wife. I mean, you've had some extraordinary things to deal with as a family. How have you dealt with that?
We communicated.
We communicated a lot. Yeah. And prayed at the end when it got really tough.
So that's interesting.
We tried to find our way through. I told Mikhaila when she was a little kid, I told her at one point when she got really sick, I said, we had a very serious conversation. She wasn't a very old girl. I said, look, kid, you're going to have a very hard life. It's going to be brutal. And this is after we knew she had the worst case of arthritis that the Toronto Sick Kids Hospital had ever seen. That's not a diagnosis you want to hear from a hospital, not a big hospital. Like, your child has the worst case of this illness we've ever seen. It's like, what's her prognosis? Multiple early joint replacements. So that's like painful degeneration followed by early death. Oh yeah, that's not so good. Well, so what's worse than that? Well, what's worse than that is adopting the role of victim, becoming resentful, and turning against life, because then you get to have multiple early collapsed joints followed by death, and you get to be ultimately miserable and in hell at the same time. So I sat her down and I said, look, kid, don't ever use your illness as an excuse. Like, it's going to be difficult for you to do things, difficult for you to get up in the morning to go to school. It's going to be painful. And it's even going to be hard for you to tell when you can do something and when you can't, when you're justified in saying, look, Dad, I just can't get out of bed. I said, don't fool yourself about your illness, because then you won't be able to distinguish what you can do from what you can't do, and then you will truly be lost. And she listened. You know, I don't think you were more than about 9 or 10 when we had that conversation. She listened. Yeah. I had a conversation with my son at about the same time. You know, and I said, look, kid, your sister is very sick and we're screwed. And the probability that I'm going to be able to pay sufficient attention to you for the next few years is like 0. You're going to have to like face this, and you're going to have to grow up and take this on yourself. And you cannot be any trouble, because we've got enough trouble. Any more, it's going to sink us. And so he listened, and he was no trouble. I mean, how was Julian with you when you were at home?
Good, very good. Compassionate for somebody who's fairly disagreeable.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he stuck around. He was at home. I mean, he had lots of friends, and he did his teenage things, but he came home and he helped, and he was no trouble.
We have a clip,
he had his things to deal with, but he took care of them himself.
We have a clip of you guys with Julian, I think, just several years ago, which will show people, to show who Julian is.
And so one of the great ways to figure out what to write about is, well, what bugs you? Notice that. That's that involuntary rumination. That's the manifestation of underlying complexes from a psychoanalytic perspective. So something's on your mind, poking you, bugging you. It's like Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio.
That is really annoying.
That's why I did it, man. I knew that would bug you.
It's a great clip. We don't see a lot of Julian. You know, he's not as high profile as you two. But you're a very tight family. I mean, Mikhaila, the way your dad talked that, it could be taken as being tough love, or it could be just a reality check of, look, you can either spend the next few years of your life feeling sorry for yourself, or you can crack on with life and make the best of it, which is exactly the advice I would have given one of my children in that position. But how did you feel at the time you were given it?
Well, I think I remember that, and I think I was in grade 2. So I would have been 7 or 8. I was pretty little. So I didn't even, like, at that time, I didn't even understand what arthritis was. I thought, oh, great, I have an old person disease. That's as much as I understood, and I didn't want to tell anybody about it because it was an old person disease. And so I don't even think I had second thoughts about anything Dad said because I was so young. I just figured, okay, that's my dad, that's what he says I should do, then I'll do it. I don't think I thought anything more than that. But I do think that was instrumental in getting out of chronic illness, honestly.
Yeah, because you barely got out of it. If you would have complicated it up with some additional stupidity, some resentment, well, I think that's probably true in our family in general. I mean, we didn't do things perfectly, but we did our best not to be resentful, and resentment is really a killer. I think if you would have burdened yourself with victimized resentment, you wouldn't have made it.
Yeah, you know what I did rather than become resentful? And I don't know if this was a healthy thing to do, but I got really angry. Mm-hmm. I didn't get angry at anybody per se. I got angry in a, it wasn't feeling sorry for myself, but it was, what am I gonna do to get out of this?
That's
like, how dare
man.
Life do this to me? That's not who I am.
Yep.
So I was angry for a long time.
Yeah, well, that's part of, one of the things you want to do is you want to get your anger on your side. You want to put it inside instead of facing you and stopping you. You want to use it as a force that drives you forward. And you definitely did that. You were a pretty implacable person.
It's interesting listening to you both talking about that, because I had a fascinating conversation a few years ago with Joe Biden, who had just lost his son Beau to brain cancer. And obviously he'd also, many years before, lost his wife and baby daughter in a car crash. And his 2 sons survived and were badly hurt and so on. And everyone knows the story, but I'd written a newspaper column about Beau Biden after he died, because he used to come on my old show at CNN. And I just said, look, this guy was an amazing guy. He'd been a state's attorney general. He'd been an Iraq war hero. He had a lovely family. He was going right to the top, I felt, politically. He may even have become president candidate, perhaps. And I said, he'll now be the best president America will never know they could have had. And I wrote this column, heartfelt. I liked him very much. I thought he was very impressive. And Joe Biden called me. He was vice president at the time. And I'd never met him. And he had a 15, 20-minute conversation with me. And I asked him, I said, I've got 4 children. I don't know how you would ever deal with losing a child. You've had to do this twice, and you lost your first wife. How do you deal with it? And he said, it's interesting. He said, as I talk to you, I have in front of me a cartoon strip, Hagar the Horrible. And it was in 2 parts. And in one part, Hagar was on a boat that was floundering on the rocks. And he had his trident, and he was raising it to the skies in very stormy conditions and shouting at the gods, why me? And in the second part of the cartoon, the gods shout back, why not? And he said he got annoyed originally when he saw that. When his dad had found it in a flea market. He got annoyed. He thought it was insensitive. And then the more he thought about it, the more he realized what his dad was saying, which is you cannot rationalize what's happened to you. You can't try and work out why it's happened to you. Stuff happens like this to people all the time. In a way, it's different, but the way that you talk to Mikhaila about her condition, it's kind of similar. Is that you didn't waste time and energy trying to rationalize this or explain why you'd been singled out. It was just a case of it's happened, we've got to deal with it.
Well, I went to Jerusalem with a friend of mine, Jonathan Pageau, and Pageau's a very brilliant man. And we walked the Via Dolorosa, which is the route of Christ's Passion with its 12 stations. And each station is a kind of, is a microcosm of suffering. And then, of course, the entire journey culminates in the most unjust suffering imaginable. And that's what the story is. The Christian Passion is the story of the most unjust suffering imaginable. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with you? And the answer is, that's going to happen to you. There's going to be unjust suffering in your life. And you're called upon to radically embrace that and to say yes. And that's even the case if it's your children who are called upon to make the sacrifice. And that's the story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. God calls on Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And, that seems like a bit much, but you have to offer your children to the world. You have to offer your children to be destroyed by the world. You have to say yes to that radically, full-heartedly. And the more you do that, weirdly, paradoxically, the more you do both of those, accept that for yourself, accept that for your children, welcome it, the less catastrophic this sacrifice has to be. It's so paradoxical. Well, you think about it, if you protect your children unduly, you weaken them. If you let them encounter the world and the micro tragedies that go along with that encounter, let's say, they get strong.
Yeah.
And there's no limit to that. There's no upper end. And so that's why in the Judeo-Christian tradition, for example, you're enjoined to take up your cross and bear it and to walk uphill nonetheless. And the reason for that is there is no better alternative. Of course, you have to say yes to life. And that means saying yes to some pretty brutal realities.